What's the most adult decision you had to make before you turned 18? When I was 17, my older brother Matthew was diagnosed with kidney disease. This wasn't completely unexpected. He'd been feeling unwell for months, but we all thought it was just stress from college. The diagnosis changed everything. The doctors explained he would need a transplant within a year. Our parents immediately got tested, but neither was compatible. My sister Barbara, who was 22 and living across the country, flew home to get tested too. She wasn't a match either. That left me and our cousins, aunts, and uncles. Everyone agreed to get tested. I didn't think much about what it would mean if I was a match. I just went to the hospital with my mom, gave blood samples, and went through a physical exam. 2 weeks later, the transplant coordinator called our house. I picked up because everyone else was out. "You're a potential match for Matthew," she said. "We need you to come in for additional testing." I hung up and sat at the kitchen table for an hour, not moving. When my mom came home with groceries, I told her. She put the bags down and started making calls to my dad and Barbara. The additional testing was more intense. They explained all the risks, complications from surgery, potential long-term effects, recovery time. I would miss at least 3 weeks of school during my senior year. There was also a small chance my remaining kidney could fail someday, which would put me in Matthew's position. I didn't tell any of my friends what was happening. Sylvia, my best friend since elementary school, knew something was wrong, but stopped asking when I changed the subject repeatedly. I didn't want advice or sympathy. This wasn't a decision I could crowdsource. My parents were careful not to pressure me. "It has to be your choice," my dad said during dinner one night. That made it harder somehow. Part of me wanted them to just tell me what to do. The hardest part was talking to Matthew. He wouldn't discuss it. When I brought it up, he changed the subject or left the room. One night, I cornered him in the kitchen when everyone else was asleep. "If you don't want my kidney, just say so." He looked at me for a long time. "I don't want you to regret this when you're older." That was the first time I considered that this decision would affect my entire life, not just the next few months. I was planning to go to college next year. How would surgery affect that? What about playing soccer, which I loved? What about future health insurance costs? What if I had kids someday who needed a kidney? My cousin Jonathan came over one evening to play video games with Matthew. Afterward, he pulled me aside. "My dad donated a kidney to his brother 15 years ago. He's never regretted it, but he says it wasn't simple." Jonathan's dad was my Uncle Dexter, who I rarely saw because he lived on the West Coast. I hadn't known about his donation. The transplant team wanted an answer soon. Matthew's kidney function was declining faster than they'd initially projected. I made a spreadsheet listing pros and cons, which felt ridiculous for a decision this big. The pro column had one entry: Matthew lives. The con column had a dozen entries about my future. One Saturday, I ran into my math teacher, Mrs. Carla Peters, at the grocery store. She asked why I seemed distracted in class. Without planning to, I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I was 16, my parents asked if I would quit school to help support the family, she said. I said no, and I've always wondered what would have happened if I'd said yes. That wasn't exactly helpful either, but it made me realize something. There was no perfect answer. Whatever I decided, I'd always wonder about the other path. The day I turned 17 and a half, I called the transplant coordinator and told her I would do it. The surgery was scheduled for the following month. When I told my parents, they hugged me so hard I couldn't breathe, which made me realize they hadn't been as neutral as they pretended. Matthew found me in my room that night. He sat on my bed and handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter he'd written, detailing all the things he planned to do with his life if the transplant worked. It was the most he'd communicated with me in months. "If you change your mind, that's okay," he said, but I didn't change my mind. 2 days before the surgery, Sylvia finally confronted me about my weird behavior. I told her everything. She was angry I hadn't said anything sooner. The night before the surgery, I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs and found Barbara sitting in the dark kitchen. She'd flown in that day to help during our recovery. "Am I making a mistake?" I asked. "Maybe," she said, "but it's your mistake to make." That was the most honest thing anyone had said to me through this whole process. The morning of the surgery, I wasn't scared like I expected. I felt calm, like this decision had somehow aged me beyond 17. The doctors explained everything again, had me sign forms, and then they wheeled me into the operating room. I didn't know then that the surgery would be just the beginning, that recovery would be harder than expected, that Matthew's body would try to reject my kidney twice before stabilizing, that I would miss prom and barely graduate with my class, that college would be deferred for a year. I also didn't know that 5 years later, Matthew would be healthy and working at his dream job, while I would still occasionally worry every time my back hurt or I got a fever.